I remember the exact click of the elevator door. It sounded small, but it broke everything. I stood frozen with the contract in my hand, and the floor under me felt like it had dropped away. The conference room on the top floor was glass and bright. I had rehearsed my speech for weeks. I had poured my life into the pitch that would save the small team I led. The CEO smiled as if he owned the sun. Then he slid the folder back across the table and said, "We're going another direction. My contract, the numbers we'd promised to investors, the project timeline, everything I had built was erased in one breath." I heard Lauren gasp behind me. I heard colleagues whisper. They announced that someone else would get the credit and the funding. Someone I had trusted. I felt my chest tighten. The word betrayal rode the air like a storm siren. I tried to speak, but the room filled with polite nods and empty eyes. I walked out with the weight of a lie pressing in. That night, my inbox filled with a single message. "Congratulations on your new role." It was sent by the person who had stolen everything. I could not sleep. My mind rewound every conversation, every late night, every shared joke. How did I miss the way that person smiled at investors? How did I miss the meetings I was excluded from? My phone B-nose buzzed with a text from an old friend, asking if I was okay. I lied and said yes. I told myself that anger would pass. But at dawn, I walked the city streets and tasted betrayal like copper. I thought about quitting, but the idea of walking away felt worse than staying and fighting. I had built my team from scratch. People trusted me. I could not let a lie erase their work. I needed evidence. I needed the truth that would undo the carefully woven story they told the board. I started with simple things, a list of meetings I had been excluded from, screenshots of emails, and my notes. I checked security logs, attendance sheets, anything that proved my presence when decisions were made. Each small clue felt like a seed. I promised myself I would uncover everything, no matter how dark the roots were. The first real break came when I found a deleted file on the shared server. It was labeled proposal_final_v2. I knew I had last edited it. The trash logs showed it had been removed the night before the board presentation. My hands shook as I recovered the file. Inside were my charts, my footnotes, my timeline, every idea I had pitched. But in the saved copy used in the presentation, an extra section appeared. It credited a name I barely recognized from another department. How could this happen? I traced metadata and found timestamps that didn't match the presentation. Someone had copied my work, added their name, and moved the file into a folder labeled executive. The more I dug, the more the pattern showed itself. Meetings renamed, emails forwarded without me, calendar invites altered. Someone was cleaning up my trail. I felt both fury and a strange cold precision. This was not a mistake. It was an organized theft. I made a copy of everything onto an external drive and hid it in my bag. The stakes felt higher now. This was not just my career. It was the team's future and the trust of everyone who believed in me. I went back to the office the next morning with a quiet plan. I smiled at the receptionist and navigated the buzz of the open floor like a shark moving through water. People asked, "Are you okay?" and offered fake concern. I nodded and set my laptop in the empty corner of the common area. If they had moved the credit, then they had left loose ends. I watched the person who took my work. They acted normal, laughing with colleagues, carrying a boxy lunch. But I noticed small things, a broken coffee mug tucked into a desk drawer, a peculiar pen that always seemed to be clenched tight when they spoke, a planner full of neat handwriting that matched the text from the stolen slides. I took photos with a small camera app. Each snapshot felt like a small victory. That day, during a lunch meeting, they left the room in a hurry. I leaned into the desk and found a sticky note with a client name and a time. It matched one of the unauthorized calls I had tracked. My pulse quickened. The timeline was forming. I had enough to ask HR to restore certain files and to demand a meeting about the altered material. They smiled thinly and promised to look into it. Promises were cheap. Evidence was not. Late that night, I received an anonymous message. It said, "Meet me at the river tomorrow. Bring proof." My first thought was danger. My second thought was curiosity. I was tired of polite refusals. I wanted someone who knew the truth or who had been wronged. At dawn, the river was a cold line of gray beneath the city. The person who emerged from the shadows was thin and nervous. She said her name was Nina and that she worked in logistics. She had seen meetings where executives rehearsed talking points. She watched one person rehearse my ideas and claim them as their own. She handed me a packet, handwritten notes, call logs, and a small flash drive. "I can't go to HR," she whispered. "They'll find me." I studied the materials and felt the shape of the betrayal grow clear. Nina's notes matched my recovered file exactly. She told me about a chain of favors, quiet promises, and threats. She had been paid off to move documents. I felt grateful and sick. If Nina had risked herself, so could I, but I also knew danger was real. We made a plan. She would create plausible reasons to be near the executive's desk while I checked the deleted archives. We agreed to meet again, and I walked away with the flash drive burning holes in my pocket. The next week, I started to stitch together patterns that reached farther than I imagined. Names kept surfacing, people who sat at lunches, joked in corridors, and pretended to be neutral. Their signatures were on altered memos. A consultant firm we'd worked with kept resurfacing in the chain of emails, always after a certain point. I called the consultant under the pretense of a new project. The person I spoke with, Samuel, was polite and evasive. He mentioned streamlining and optimizing credit as if it were normal. I pressed and listened for nerves. He hemmed and said, "Sometimes ideas need shepherding to sell." I wrote down his words. When I cross-referenced invoices, I found payments routed to obscure accounts. The money trail smelled of shell companies. My stomach turned. This wasn't simply about one person taking a slide deck. It was a system built to harvest other people's work. I felt the anger flare into determination. I met with 2 members of my own team and showed them a small portion of the evidence. They were shocked, angry, and suddenly dangerous in their resolve. We formed a tight circle. We would no longer be victims. We would find one solid proof that could bring this down. We decided to use a board meeting as a stage. The plan was risky. Expose the fraud in front of people who trusted the perpetrators. I drafted a briefing that summarized the pattern in plain language. I would ask for 1 minute at the Q&A. My team would back me. We rehearsed tone and pace. When the day came, my hands were steady but my throat was dry. I stood in the back and listened as the executives praised the new direction. When they opened the floor, I walked to the lectern and asked a simple question about the timeline and document ownership. The room went quiet. The chief operating officer responded with practiced charm. I pushed. I asked for the files. He smiled and said they were proprietary. I asked again and his smile cracked. My team handed me a flash drive under the table. I plugged it into my laptop and projected the recovered slides. For a beat, the room was frozen. Then the person who had claimed my work laughed, too loud, and accused me of sabotage. The CEO looked at me like a disappointed child. I felt a wave of fear. Then the file's metadata displayed timestamps matching my earlier notes. The laughter died. A woman on the board whispered, "This can't be right." The silence after that had weight. We had opened a door. The fallout was immediate and raw. Emails flew, accusations swarmed, and the person who had stolen my work became defensive and volatile. HR promised an investigation. The CEO called a closed-door meeting and asked me to leave. I refused. I stood my ground, repeating the facts. Outside, the media pinged my phone, whispers of scandal. I had to slow my breath. Our tight circle grew. Other employees came forward with small stories, credit taken, bonuses diverted, promises broken. It felt like a long chain snapping. But the other side fought smarter. They leaked a private email that painted me as bitter and vengeful. Suddenly, the narrative shifted for some. I saw headlines that favored the charismatic thief. I felt my heart lurch with betrayal again. My team began to fear retaliation. Someone scratched a slur on my building's elevator. Legal contacted me and said that lawsuits could drag for years. I realized exposing the truth might ruin people's lives, including mine. I lay awake and had to ask myself hard questions. Was revenge worth the cost? Could I seek justice without becoming ruthless? I promised to be firm, not cruel. I would protect my team and clear our names without hurting innocents. The next twist arrived in the form of financial records. I hired an independent auditor with the support of a few allies. He brought patterns that looked like tiny worms burrowing through our contracts. Payments labeled as consulting, had been redirected to a shell company owned by a close associate of the person who stole my work. It linked back to the consultant Samuel, and his name pulsed like a bruise. I met Samuel again, and he finally broke. He admitted he'd mediated between executives and had helped tidy presentation materials for pay. He wouldn't confess to outright theft, but his voice cracked when I mentioned the shell accounts. He suggested there were layers above the executive, people who wanted control of intellectual property so they could package and sell it. Each admission painted the picture smoother and darker. Someone higher up had orchestrated a system where ideas were collected and assigned new faces for profit. I felt both vindicated and sick. The game was bigger than any single betrayal. If I pulled this thread, the whole fabric might unravel and topple powerful people. I had to be careful. I also knew that the evidence now had teeth. The auditor's report made our case credible in ways words alone could not. Just when I thought we had a narrative, an unexpected ally emerged. The person who had stolen my work sent me a private message. Their voice sounded raw, different from the polished public persona. They claimed they had been forced into a role, threatened with ruin if they didn't comply. They named the names of board members and hinted at blackmail. My stomach turned. Could the perpetrator be both villain and victim? I arranged a meeting in a cafe that hummed with early evening people and the smell of coffee. They arrived hunched, eyes darting. They spoke in bursts. Promises made to save family members, threats if they refused, a ledger that showed payments stopping if they attempted to leave the scheme. I listened, torn. Their admission did not excuse theft, but it offered a deeper truth. Corruption had teeth that bit both stealer and stolen. I was left confused and angry. I could expose them or use their confession to flip them to our side. I chose to offer a conditional truce, help expose the higher chain if they admitted publicly. They hesitated. That night, I wondered if justice could be negotiated with someone who had once cut me off at the knees. We began to plan a careful sting. The person who had stolen my work agreed to wear a recorder and feed us meetings that would show the higher-ups directing the scheme. We set the trap around a fake pitch, a new project that would tempt the corrupt to show their teeth. My role was to appear defeated, to let them believe I had backed down. We spread a rumor of a consultant with exclusive access to a lucrative client. Word traveled fast. The person at the center of the theft acted eager and arranged a meeting with those above. The day of the meeting, my team set up secure recording devices and a hidden backup. The room felt like the calm before a storm as executives discussed allocations and brand leverage. Voices dropped when they mentioned clearing, authors, and routing fees. The recorded conversation named accounts that matched the shell companies from the auditor's report. We had them. After the meeting, adrenaline made my hands shake. The person who had agreed to help looked at me with a mixture of shame and relief. We now had hard evidence of conspiracy and coercion. But with proof came danger. When powerful people are threatened, they lash out. I knew the next move would be aggressive and personal. That night my apartment was ransacked. Drawers were pulled out and papers strewn. My safe had been pried, but somehow the external drive with the core evidence was untouched. Whoever had broken in knew I would hide what mattered. They left a note. Stop or lose more. I felt the message in my bones. My friends wanted me to go into hiding. My legal counsel advised caution. I refused. Fear thrummed under my skin, but fury steadied my hands. We increased security, encrypted files, and set up redundant backups. The stolen meeting audio was leaked to a friend at a local paper who promised discretion. The friend called at dawn with a trembling voice. The paper wanted to run the story but feared legal backlash. We agreed on an embargoed release timed with a press conference where we would present the auditor's report, the recordings, and testimonies. We made a list of who would speak and what they would say. I practiced a calm tone that would not betray the storm inside me. The world felt poised. If the press ran the story, the industry would watch. If it didn't, we would be exposed to retaliation without public accountability. I slept little, but each hour felt purposeful. The countdown had begun. The press conference was both cleansing and brutal. Cameras flashed like a swarm as we laid out documents, clips, and names. I spoke last, voice steady, describing the pattern, the theft, and the system. The person once praised for charisma listened with a collapsing mask. As I finished, questions flew. The accused begged for due process. The CEO called the allegations distortions. But a new element changed the tone. One of the board members stood up and said they had known of unusual payments, but had been assured they were legitimate. The revelation sparked deeper probes. Regulators announced an inquiry. The accused person sputtered excuses that became less plausible as more facts unfurled. The industry reacted with shock and a hunger for answers. In the weeks that followed, clients pulled contracts and investors demanded audits. My inbox is filled with supportive notes and hateful ones. Some colleagues lost jobs, some resigned in shame. I watched as the house of cards continued to wobble. Yet, victory felt fragile. People I trusted warned me that toppled people often reach for desperate measures. Still, the world had seen the proof. The betrayal was out in the open now. I felt both triumph and a deep sadness for the wounds left behind. After the public revelations, alliances shifted like sand. Some former allies returned, bearing apologies and new evidence. A whisper became a chorus as more employees came forward with their own small betrayals. Ideas co-opted, promotions promised and denied. A pattern of coercion in trade deals emerged that tied back to a board member's private consulting firm. I worked closely with investigators who dug through months of transactions. Each new file showed deliberate appropriation. But the deeper we dug, the more complex it became. Names of investors who had benefited surfaced. They claimed ignorance or plausible deniability. I felt like I was peeling an onion, each layer bringing tears. The person who had once stolen my work attempted a public apology that felt thin and rehearsed. Many accepted it. Some did not. I listened and measured. I knew the system needed dismantling, but I also knew destruction without repair could ruin innocent people. My goals softened into rebuilding safeguards, clearer contracts, transparent credit, and a whistleblower system. The fight was bigger than vindication. It was about changing the way our industry treated creators. I realized revenge without construction meant the same holes would appear again. As the investigations continued, new threats emerged. An unexpected lawsuit accused me of defamation. The legal papers were precise and aggressive. The accused had hired a firm skilled at silencing whistleblowers. Their strategy was delay, smear, and intimidation. I met with my attorney and learned the legal costs could bankrupt me. My team rallied and launched a fundraiser to cover expenses. Donations came from former colleagues and strangers who believed in fairness. The case dragged on, each court date a grit in my mouth. Yet every subpoena pulled more documents into the light. Witnesses who had been silent before found courage and came forward. Some testified about being paid small sums to alter records. The courtroom became another battleground. I sat through days of cross-examination that tried to portray me as bitter and unreliable. I held my ground. I told the truth plainly, and the jury watched. The person F, who had stolen my work, took the stand, their story twisting between fear and self-preservation. When the judge ruled to allow the most damning recordings as evidence, the accused defense unraveled. The process was brutal and slow, but it proved that persistence could win against money and influence. A new twist arrived when an unexpected ally from a rival company contacted me. He had been tipped off about similar practices and offered data that matched our findings. He wanted a partnership to create an industry-wide registry to track idea ownership. It was an olive branch that extended far beyond my personal fight. We spoke late into the night about contracts, code, and reputation. He admitted his company had also benefited once from murky deals and wanted to make amends. I was wary, but the idea of systemic change excited me. Together, we drafted a proposal for a public register and a set of best practices that would protect creators. We presented the draft to industry groups, and surprisingly, it received cautious interest. The momentum began to shift from scandal to reform. This felt like the start of something true. Yet, as we pushed structural change, we faced resistance from those who profited from opacity. Lobbyists lined up, and the fight moved into committee rooms and legal halls. The stakes widened. This was no longer just about my stolen deck, it was about culture. I felt both tired and buoyed. For the first time, the idea that we could build a safer future felt possible. Just when the momentum seemed to tilt in our favor, an unexpected betrayal struck from inside my circle. One team member I trusted leaked a private message to the media that painted our strategy as manipulative. The leak attacked my motives and suggested I sought fame. I felt as if someone had taken the air from the room. Trust cracked again. I confronted the team member in a quiet room and asked why. They looked worn and afraid, and confessed they had been promised a position if they turned the story. Anger flared, but I listened. They felt trapped between loyalty and security. I offered them a choice: stay and be honest, or leave and keep their dignity. They chose to stay and to help repair the damage by revealing who had approached them. Their confession opened a new lead. A PR firm working to smear whistleblowers had been coordinating narratives. The pattern of manipulation ran deeper than we knew. I realized revenge could be twofold: expose the theft and clear the reputations of those used as pawns. I learned that truth often requires forgiving small betrayals to tackle the big ones. The pressure took a toll on my body and the team's morale. Some days I felt like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Yet small victories kept us moving. Contracts rewritten, an internal watchdog launched, and a formal apology from the consultant firm. The accused executive resigned, though they denied wrongdoing in public statements. The board shuffled like a deck of cards, and one influential member stepped down. The regulator announced fines. The industry conversations shifted from scandal gossip to policy. I felt a hollow triumph, satisfaction mixed with the cost of scars. I walked into studios and meetings that felt different, like town squares after a storm, people cautious, eyes more open. The rival company's registry idea gained traction, and a pilot program started. I debated whether to return to leading my old team or to move into advocacy full-time. Each path felt heavy with responsibility. I thought about Nina, who had first helped me, and about the person who admitted they had been coerced. Some people needed rebuilding. Some needed consequences. I started to dream of a future where creators' names were safe. It was a fragile hope, but it was real. Then came a personal blow. My mother called with news that family finances had been targeted. Old debts reappeared as if conjured. I realized the attacks were not only professional but personal. Someone was aiming to unmoor me completely. I spent nights tracking accounts and found transactions tied to the same shell companies. The pattern suggested intimidation, make you so unstable that you retreat. My heart felt heavy. I sat with my mother and explained as much as I could without scaring her. She hugged me and said something I hadn't heard before: "You were always brave." That small praise steadied me. We worked with forensic accountants and tightened family accounts. My friends pooled resources, and a neighbor offered practical help. The personal hit hard in my resolve. If they would go after my family, they would not win. We redoubled our efforts to push the registry and to demand legal protections for whistleblowers. I also arranged protections for my team and family. The fight was no longer abstract. It had teeth that bit into the life I loved. I refused to let fear be the victor. A surprising ally appeared in the form of an investigative journalist eager to dig deeper. He had found a paper trail in a small overseas office that suggested the shell companies were part of a larger laundering network. Together, we traveled to a port city where invoices had been shuffled through a web of companies. The trip felt cinematic and dangerous. We met a source, an accountant who had quietly kept copies of ledgers and emails. He slid a folder across the table like a secret. Inside were entries that directly connected a major investor to the shell company. The investor had influence over several board members. I felt the scope of the conspiracy swell. This evidence could topple not just a person, but a network that had long propped up predatory deals. We rushed documents back to our legal team, and the journalist prepared a series of exposés. The stakes skyrocketed. Powerful people sensed danger and pushed back harder. Threats increased, but so did public interest. People began to talk about systemic reform with real urgency. I realized that truth could be contagious. Once one part of a system is exposed, the rest becomes brittle. Resistance turned into retaliation. A smear campaign targeted me personally, dredging up past mistakes and twisting them into evidence of bad character. Old friends received doctored messages, and my public image became a battlefield. For a moment, the noise drowned out our facts. I feared the narrative would revert to blaming the whistleblower. I had to act decisively. I sat down with a journalist and gave an exclusive interview that laid out the full story. My personal stakes, the facts, the evidence, and the human cost. I did not soften my words. I spoke plainly about the system and how it ate people. The interview ran across major outlets and shifted the tide. People saw me as a person, not a caricature. Donations came in for legal costs and for the registry pilot. Lawmakers called for hearings. The accused found fewer places to hide. It was a turning point. Public empathy overturned manufactured doubt. Still, the legal battles and personal wounds remained. I learned that honesty, even when raw, could be a potent armor. The hearings were public spectacles. Witnesses testified, including the person who had once taken my work. They confessed to participating under pressure and named names that confirmed our evidence. Some high-profile executives denied wrongdoing, but the weight of testimony and documents made denials hollow. Regulators announced penalties and restrictions. Investors began to reevaluate relationships that had been quiet transactions for years. The registry pilot gained funding and interest from several companies. Change that had felt theoretical began to take concrete shape. Yet, the process was messy. Some people wanted harsher punishments. Others wanted restorative measures. I found myself mediating between retribution and reform, balancing justice with rebuilding. I pushed for accountability that included restitution and structural change. It felt like guiding a ship through a storm toward calmer waters. My team and I were exhausted but determined. In quiet moments, I thought of the first click of the elevator and how small that sound had once set everything into motion. We had come far, but the work of prevention would be long. As the legal dust settled, the industry slowly shifted. Contracts started including clear credit clauses. The registry pilot expanded into a voluntary industry standard. The whisper network that once traded favors began to lose its power. I found myself asked to speak at conferences and to advise on policy. People introduced me as the woman who helped change the way we credit ideas. The title felt heavy and odd. I had not sought fame. I had wanted fairness. I thought often of those who had helped. Nina, the accountant in the port city, the journalist, and even the person who had stolen my work but later confessed. We had all been pieces in a puzzle. Change felt communal. I returned to my old team with offers of new projects under transparent terms. The team members who had stood with me received promotions and protections. Some who had been harmed left to start their own ventures, empowered by the new rules. I felt relief and an ache for those who had been hurt beyond repair. Power had shifted, but people still needed time to heal. In the quiet after the storm, I allowed myself a rare moment of rest. I walked by the river where I had first met Nina. I thought about the path from anger to careful action. Revenge had not been my aim. Justice was. I found that being firm with heart mattered, holding wrongdoers accountable while protecting those who had been coerced. I had tested the limit of what one person could change, and the result was imperfect but meaningful. My relationship with the person who had stolen my work evolved into something complex. They apologized publicly, offered restitution, and entered a rehabilitation program. Some called it too lenient. Others said it was humane. I had no simple answers. What mattered to me was building safety nets so future creators wouldn't be prey. I started working full-time on the registry and on policies that enforced transparency. The work required patience, empathy, and fierce boundaries. I realized the story I had wanted to tell was not only about betrayal, but about repair. Years later, the industry was not perfect, but it was different. The registry had become standard at many companies. Whistleblower protections were stronger. People credited creators more transparently. My name remained tied to the scandal, but it also carried a sense of change. I often received messages from young creators thanking me for making space safer for their ideas. That meant more than any award. The person who had once stolen my work rebuilt their life quietly and later worked with us on a panel about coercion, an odd and fragile reconciliation. I learned that powerful systems can be toppled with stubborn truth and careful alliances. I also learned revenge without heart corrupts. My victory had been firm, not cruel. The scars stayed, but they reminded me of what was at stake: trust, dignity, and the right to be seen for one's work. On an ordinary morning, hearing the elevator click, I smiled slightly. The sound no longer terrified me. It reminded me that small moments can change everything, and that standing up, even when afraid, can shift an industry for the better. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and tap the bell to get notified the moment we drop a new story, and don't forget to like the video to help others find it.